Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. What role do school principals play in reconciliation with Indigenous communities? Our guest this episode is Wayne Davies, Instructor and Director of Student Teaching, Faculty of Education, University of Winnipeg in Manitoba. He suggests that often school districts are too large and classrooms are too small, yet school-wide reconciliation is just right, and the principal is the key.
This episode is brought to you by Two-Eyed Seeing, which comes from the Mi'kmaq, meaning the gift of multiple perspectives. Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall of Eskasoni First Nation in Nova Scotia introduced this concept, which emphasizes that different worldviews and knowledge systems are complementary rather than conflicting, promoting collaboration rather than competition. It serves as a guiding principle for blending Indigenous knowledge systems with Western science and practices. Both perspectives should be valued equally and used together to address complex problems such as educational reform without one overshadowing the other.
Check out our website, www.restorative.ca, for some simple yet profound ways that can help you ask the questions that promote reconciliation in your school with Indigenous communities. Now let's join our hosts, Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. Let's begin with reconciliation. And how is a school principal ideally set up to address so much that needs to happen in terms of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada?
Yeah, and I'll be clear too, that like my personal where I am, I Red River Métis. I'm a citizen of the Manitoba Métis Federated, the Red River Nation. And so it's important to me, but it always has been. When I started my career, I started on Lac Aux Lambs in Port Simpson in Northwest BC. I got to see and be engaged by the Tsimshian people, and they treated me, and I understood it. It was transformative. I began to see the world a different way. I got to understand some things, right? If I would highly advise any of your listeners, Google the Peasant Farming Act and read that. And that will, if you ever want to know about systemic racism or how an early intervention by the Canadian government in the 1880s could have an impact on today, the Peasant Farming Act will explain that. Is a really good explanation of that. So I think the first thing you got to do as a principal is you have to have some awareness, and you have to build your awareness and be willing to admit you don't know it all, because I certainly don't. But your position, and I've had some really strong teachers, and I was a teacher that I feel like I was okay. And I tried to move the needle, but you can only do so much from your classroom when you're one of 35 or one of 85 or one of, in one school I was at, one of 235 staff. It was a massive high school. And then as an assistant soup, I did a lot of things, but I could only push as far as I could. And it really was at that moment I noticed that the principal has the ability to turn the boat, the school, on a dime if they really want to. They can pilot it by putting pressure here or money there, or taking money away, or taking resources or responsibility off of people's backs, whatever they want. So that's one thing. So when I did my doctorate, I actually looked at high school graduation rates across Manitoba. And what we noticed was that over the last several years, there's always been a disparity, and the disparity has always been wide, and actually it's growing right now. But both rates are coming up. So people feel very good about that. But the 4-year graduation rate for Indigenous kids in Manitoba is 50.1%, while it's 90.3% for everybody else. And Dustin Louis, and at the University of British Columbia, the NITEP's director, he's done some similar work, similar situation. So why is that happening, right? So there's one thing for a school leader. You got to ask questions about why, instead of just accepting the way it is. I remember being a teacher in northern BC, and the kids talking about racism and me. And then we went to a record store. We were at a basketball tournament. We went into a record store. All my kids had to keep their backpacks by the door. Meanwhile, there was a white team walked in. They didn't have to. And then we saw them stealing. And my kids were asking me, were we going to turn them in? And I was like, no, that's on the store owner, man. That's karma. We're going to get out of here, though, so we don't get blamed. So it's about an awareness. The other thing for me is it's about listening to people. So in my doctorate, I talked a lot about listening to kids. And so I've had lots of success when I was at Selkirk Junior High as a principal. We were struggling with our device policy. I had the kids write it. They at least write the first draft, and I sat down with them, and we actually came up with something that they put into place, that they enforced, and I didn't have to, and it worked. So there's student voice is really important. There's been some great research around that. The other one is parents. Are you listening to your caregivers and your parents? And are you expanding that idea of parents into caregivers? Because a lot of our kids are with people that aren't biologically their parents or their direct parents. But that's important. One of the concepts that you can start thinking about, or people could think about, is two-eyed seeing. Two-eyed seeing is a concept that Indigenous parents, it was proffered by Albert Marshall, a Mi'kmaq elder. One eye is looking at 21st century skills. All these skills, we keep repackaging them, we keep renaming them, but essentially they're the soft skills that people need. And there's the literacy and the numeracy and all the good stuff. But they also, out of the other eye, are saying, like, look, I want my kids to be able to understand who they are, to be proud of who they are, and to be able to do stuff. So here's a good example. I'm right now helping student teachers get into the north of Manitoba to do some placements and practicums in schools that there's no way they could get to without our help. Nelson House, which is an hour west of Thompson, Manitoba, is a 3,500 person community with 2 schools, quite large, one brand new high school, one school to be built. The elementary is going to be replaced soon. And at the high school, every day, 6 kids get picked. Couple days beforehand, so they know, 6 kids go out on the land with 2 guys from the community. I'm not 100% sure both graduated, but they should have their PhDs on being on the land. So they have skidoos, they have boats, they have all the equipment they need, and they take these 6 kids out and they go on the land. They hunt, they trap, they fish, they navigate the land, all those good things. And so when I was up there, I had lunch, and I was eating lunch. It was moose stew. It was moose stew the kids caught shot and butchered and brought back and prepared the whole thing. But if the power goes out, those are the kids I want to be hanging out with because they can provide. And so when people talk about all these really important skills that kids have to have, they also have to think about this other side. And Indigenous parents are very good at pointing that out to you. And that's really important. And then the third part of it as a principal is understanding and embracing the concept of nothing for us without us. We tend to rush into situations as school leaders with solutions because that's what we're trained to do. See a problem, fix the problem, move on. We don't take enough time to diagnose the problem. And then when we impose a solution and we haven't talked to the people that and that goes for our teachers, our EAs, our kids, our caregivers, everybody, we got to slow down. And we have to look at it through a couple of those lenses. One is academically, sure, but also culturally. Does this make sense? Does this work? And I think when principals start to embrace those 3 kind of corners of the triangle, and then you start thinking about layering in some culture that not Dreamcatcher Week, which I friggin' hate, but actually, here's a really cool thing we did at Charles Hayes Secondary in Prince Rupert. A buddy of mine carves gold and silver. He also paints. He does all kinds of paints drums. He does all this kind of stuff. We had a program where we'd bring artisans into the school, into the classrooms to speak to everybody. And so I said, no, because not all the kids are interested. What we did is we put them in the multi-purpose room just in the corner. And kids who were interested went and saw them. And it was great because afterwards at a staff meeting, a number of teachers were complaining about the amount of washroom breaks that week because it had skyrocketed. And I was like, yeah, because they're not going to the washroom. They're going to see Billy. So why don't we just make it okay to go see Billy? And that to me is a better, like all kinds of kids, not just Indigenous kids are going, but all kinds of kids. So when we want to talk about infusing culture, talking about the truth and reconciliation statements, all those things, we really need to think about it in terms of what do the kids need before we tell them what do they need. Let them tell us what they need. Let the caregivers tell us what they think they need. And then let's work together to figure that out so it makes sense for all of us. I don't think we should just carte blanche hand over the school because we do have things we have to do. But I do think that we need to have more conversations, which is tough in a world that's going 500 miles an hour.
Going right back to the beginning, when you said your early experiences where you were given the opportunity to be part of things, to understand. And that's really where it all starts, doesn't it? Being given people the ability to have an understanding and an awareness and provide with those opportunities. And maybe that's the only goal in that moment, is to provide that. And there's more that came after that, obviously. But then we know understanding shifts all sorts of attitudes. We can name all sorts of things throughout history outside of Indigenous concerns. But that's where it started for you. How are we going to create awareness? How are we going to bring awareness to the students?
Yeah, like when I hit Black Lambs as this kid from Winnipeg or Selkirk, Manitoba, and I come out there and I don't have a clue what I'm doing. Marion, who is our librarian, Marion the librarian, was a local elder, and her husband was one of the head caretakers. And so anyways, I went and asked a couple of questions, and then she asked me, do you want to come to, she had a bunch of elders that met for tea. And so I started going.
Right.
And it started off really innocuously. I just have tea. They'd ask me about my family. I'd ask them about their family. We'd share some laughs, but it got on to, Wayne, you got to have questions for us. What are they? Ask. And I was like, okay, let's talk about employment and unemployment. Why are so many people unemployed? Like, and then they started explaining how, like, you can't, when you live on reserve, the land is not yours. Hence, you cannot get a loan. Hence, you cannot start a business. Hence, you can't create employment. And when the government changed some of those rules a few years ago, all of a sudden you started to see these small mom and pop operations all start, like grassroots entrepreneurship start. I didn't know that. Now I do, and I'm able to talk about that with my friends. And so again, coming in and asking questions.
You gain trust first by having tea and just sitting without an agenda, without something we have to do. And then you're able to ask your questions.
How do you deal with, and we always call them the rocks in the road, the people who don't agree with you as the principal, who don't want to implement some of those things, the ones who complain about the kids all going to the washroom that week, even though they really weren't? How do you manage to work with those people? Because you want things to keep going in the positive direction, but we know that there are those people along the way who don't always agree with the direction we set as a principal. Any stories behind that, or any issues that you dealt with?
For sure. When I was at one school, I won't say which school, but we were doing some pretty big stuff. A totem pole was being raised. The community was gifting the school and the school division a totem pole. First totem pole to be officially raised in the community in 100 years. That wasn't a tourist totem pole. Right. And when I put out the memos of who was carrying the pole, kids, teachers could volunteer, all the things we were doing around it, I actually had somebody crumple up and jam it back in my mailbox. And so obviously, and I figured out who it was, but so then our next staff meeting, I thanked everyone, but then I told them the story, and people were like, oh my God, somebody did that. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not naming names, but you guys you're big people. And so what I did was on some levels, I just rolled right over it. Now, in other times, I heard Mark Messier speak one time. I've heard Gretzky speak and Messier speak. Messier is who you want to hang out with on a Friday night. Gretzky's the guy who's going to drive the car to get you home. Very good stuff, but interesting. But Messier talked about, if you understand the motivation of the people you work with, you're gold as a leader. If you don't understand their motivation, you are in some big trouble. And I've had some staff who, over the years, who have been harder to work with. And once I worked to get to know them, Shelley said, get to understand them, gain their trust, and ask them questions and find out what is your motivation for either putting up a roadblock or going with. I was able to work and to get farther. One story I tell is, and again, it's anonymous. A teacher was very difficult to work with. Found out that he had a family member who was a very well-known teacher in our province. And I leveraged that a bit, and I would ask him questions. What would this person think of these sorts of things? That person eventually began to make some connections and understand that yeah, maybe this is better than the way things have been. I also have lots of, the other day, I was, and I don't know if this will make it to air, but I was in an airport in the States, and the guy beside me noticed my bag. I had Red River Métis on it. He asked me about it. Oh, you're from Canada? And he started laughing with his buddy. Our next 51st state. Can't wait to roll in there and whatever. And I said, yeah, I heard Putin's taking back Alaska. And he said, don't joke about that. That's not, that's serious. And then all of a sudden he just stopped himself. And he looked at me and he apologized. And I was like, it's serious for us too.
Yes.
This isn't, we're not kidding. And so sometimes sometimes you're skillful about it and sometimes you're less skillful about it.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you shared with your friends about the Peasant Farming Act? Because I thought that was a very interesting story about the Beer and Wings and how they, because I think you started off with a question, how many Indigenous farmers do you know?
There's a few of them that were like, I don't get this whole systemic or systematic. They couldn't even know what the exact word was. Discrimination is. And I was like, okay, so I said, you guys are all farmers. I know that. And I mentioned Res when we lived there. You all lived, you're all Aggies. I said, do you know any Indigenous farmers? And they're like, no, because they're not into it. And I'm like, oh, time out. I said, and that's when I said, let's look this up. And I explained it to them. And some of them read it. And by the time we were done, they were like, they could not get over the fact that they were fully functioning, competitive farmers that were doing well and threatening to become independent. And the Canadian government quashed that because they wanted to keep them dependent. And the best part was after I was done talking to them about it, sort of thing, one of my buddies pointed over and there was a table of a few guys beside us who were all staring, listening too, because they were really interested as well. These are the stories that we don't do a good enough job explaining to people. And it's not a make you feel good. And I told them, I'm not here to make you feel guilty. Just now you know, now you understand of how things have worked. And they were shocked. Shock was the best word.
Now you're coming at things from the perspective of being a Métis, your heritage is Métis. Many school principals are not. As a matter of fact, most of them are white. So what advice would you give to them as principals who are in the Goldilocks position of not too big, not too small, but just right for reconciliation in a school?
That's a really good question. So up till 6 years ago, I was officially, I never spoke about it. Because if you understand the Métis history, in the 1870s, when Riel was hung, when everything went badly, we were dispersed. A lot of families, my dad and my grandma could never talk about it. There was no discussion unless dad had a couple of drinks. And this is a family story, and I don't care if you keep this in, that's fine. And then things would slip out, and he'd talk about land, and he would talk about agreements, and so I always was like, so I knew, but I didn't have anything official, so I was never going to say it in public. And then after he passed, eventually, because I had kids, I wanted them to know, or I wanted to know one way or the other. So I did my genealogical search. I did and my dad knew a pile of stuff. It was like wild how much he knew, but it was all just below the surface because you just couldn't talk about it. So up until 6 years ago, and so now the term I use is a reconnecting Métis person, and a lot of us use that term, is because we're coming back in touch. I will never be an elder. I will never be knowledge, like none of that stuff. I am just a guy who knows who he is. I'll never tell you I'm more than I am. I'll never tell you I'm less than I am. And up until that point, I was a white educator and would not talk about it. For me, it was always coming from a place of listening, having facts, talking to people, being aware, and talking to elders. Because elders are awesome. Most of them will tell you right off the hop, we know you're going to make mistakes. We make mistakes. Just try not to make the same mistake twice.
Right.
So if your division or district can find, or you have access to people and sit and talk with them, they will give you all kinds of information and they will give you all kinds of permissions. And then you have to navigate it from there. Most school districts now have done some good work around how do we do this? But some people right away hold up. I don't want to make a mistake because they'll come in. Who's going to come in? They're going to come in if you really screw up. Yes. And even then, for example, there was a school in Winnipeg where on Orange Shirt Day, the school leader just had a brain misfunction, and it was the school's anniversary. So they had these white shirts made up with their logo. So we had those out the night before and had all the kids wear white shirts on TRC Day. He never meant it to undermine anything, but it hit huge headlines. And what happened? The Indigenous advisors for our school district, for the school district where it happened, walked in beside him and helped him through it. They stood up with him. They didn't castigate him. They didn't embarrass him. They didn't humble him. And then it was basically, next year, let's wear some orange.
That didn't go so well. What will we do
Oh.
next time?
Here's a big surprise, that principals can lead a school in reconciliation by listening and by building relationships with students, parents, staff, and the community. Wayne includes some terrific stories which illustrate how to deal with resistance in staff and in schools. Find out more about our work with restorative circles that have some very practical how-tos for listening and for building relationships at www.restorative.ca. There's no reconciliation without truth, and the principal plays a key role in truth-telling and in reconciliation with Indigenous communities.